Dear friends, warm greetings from Fresno, California. My name is Ron Herms. It's a deep honor for me to join all of you in this service of reflection and remembrance and memory in honor of Mitchell Burton. Mitchell was a good friend of mine over a long period of time. We weren't always close in terms of geographic proximity, but every single time we had a conversation or we picked up the phone or we shared a text message exchange, there was a closeness there that's hard to express. And so it's an honor for me to join you. I'm not going to do a number of takes on this video. There may be emotion here in all of this, just like there would be if I was with you in person. So I'm grateful for the opportunity, at least virtually, to share in this with you all. Ian, thanks so much for riding shotgun with Mitchell, especially in those final months of his life, and for sharing the eulogy and the reflection that you have just ahead of all of us listening to the song Only Jesus, and now the opportunity I have to share some thoughts. So Mitchell and I had many conversations over the years, and these picked up especially over the last 16 months or so. It was just before the COVID-19 pandemic sent most of us into lockdown that Mitchell and I began texting on a regular weekly basis and then saw each other at least every 2 or 3 weeks via FaceTime for most of the next year, or for the most of that remaining year. Those were great conversations, and we would often time them to be either before or at halftime, or often after a Seahawks game, and so I'd still be in my Seahawks jersey, and Mitchell would have just watched the game, and we would have these conversations. It was a life-giving part of this past year. For me, for sure. I miss those conversations very, very much. Toward the end of those conversations, Mitchell asked, as he was planning for a service like this, he asked me if I would be willing to share some thoughts. And he told me what he wanted to share. So that's not going to surprise anyone who knows Mitchell. And so I will try to do that justice. But I also want to begin by simply recalling some of the things that were common to us in our experience and in our friendship. So I'm taking this back now to the late 1990s. It was my second opportunity in that decade to be on the pastoral team at First Assembly in Medicine Hat. And in earlier years of that decade, I had gotten to know the Burton family and Mitchell in particular through children's events at the church and summer camps and some of the different ways in which we connected with church families. And that was tons of fun. But then in the spring of 1998, we had the opportunity to go on a road trip. And those of you who know Mitchell know that he loved and looked forward to the opportunities to get out on the road. They weren't that frequent, and when he got the chance to do that, that was an amazing experience for him and for anyone he took along with him on those trips. And so thanks to the generosity of the Reinheller family at that time, in the spring of 1998, the Edmonton Oilers were making a run in the playoffs. It wasn't going to be a successful run, but Ryan Smith was an Edmonton Oiler player at that time, and he was a hero, sort of a hockey icon for Mitchell. And so we decided that we would hop in a van and take the wheelchair, and Ryan Reinheller and I would take Mitchell to an Edmonton Oilers playoff hockey game. And as it turned out, my family tagged along. And one of the reasons for that was we had some family in Edmonton that the rest of my family could see. But also we had just had Adrian, who I think was 3 weeks old, on that trip that we took up the 36 highway and then into Edmonton to go and watch that hockey game. We had dinner at my parents' house, and then we went to the game. We carried Mitch down to the seats and had a wonderful time, even though it won't surprise you to know that the Oilers lost that particular game. And then a highlight of that night was that we got to go downstairs outside the Oilers dressing room, and Ryan Smith came out after that game and spent a few minutes with us in conversation, and that was a highlight for Mitchell. It was certainly a highlight for me. I was geeking out as much as Mitchell was to have the chance to have that conversation. On the trip, one of the things that we kind of had a little compromise, because Mitchell loves music, as all of you know, and he wanted to listen to his music, but we also had a brand new baby in the van that would be sleeping most of that trip, hopefully. And so he had his headphones, and he was sitting in the seat behind the driver's seat, and I still remember him singing. And he would try to sing quietly because he knew the baby was sleeping, and he had his headphones on. And most of you will know that when you've got headphones on, you don't always know how loud you're going to get when you're singing. And he was singing a Chubbawamba song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. Ain't nothing going to keep me down. I get knocked down. And he was singing this over and over and over again. And we were killing ourselves laughing, and he was killing himself laughing on this road trip to Edmonton. We also had some really great conversations just about what it meant for Mitchell to live life. First of all, as a human being in a body that gave him some challenges and meant that he had to navigate life in a way that most of us don't ever have to think about. And we talked about, where was God in all of that? What was God doing in circumstances like that when someone is confronted with less than ideal health circumstances? And those of you who know Mitchell well will know that there were times when he was perhaps on the edge. Especially in his later years. And one of the things that he would say, he said it to me in conversation, I know he said it a lot to his mom and dad, he would tell them, it's not my time to go yet. And he had this sense of purpose. He had a sense of purpose that surprised me for anyone his age, never mind someone with the concerns and the challenges that he would face on a daily basis. I remember his love for his family, his fierce loyalty, and his desire to be in good relationship with everyone around him. I remember having sports conversations with him where he could rattle off Seahawks statistics and St. Louis Cardinals statistics and Edmonton Oilers statistics. And we would have these conversations about what was happening in the NHL and the NFL and the NBA. And it didn't matter what sport our conversation went to, he was well informed. I remember one time FaceTiming him on a Sunday afternoon of a Seahawks game, and for whatever reason, it's not a smart idea on my part, but for about 4 or 5 weeks I had been attempting to grow a beard. And the beard that I did grow in was just mostly gray. And so when he saw that I was wearing a Steve Largent jersey with this gray beard, and he remembered that Largent was a star of the Seahawks from the 1980s, he looked at me and he said, Pastor Ron, you look about as old as Steve Largent's career. And he was unafraid to just simply say it the way he saw it. So that was his way of telling me, you should shave because you don't look so good right now. And the thing that always was remarkable to me to pick up on with Mitchell was that he did not want to die, and he felt as though his life had tremendous purpose. And you might ask yourself, what are the conditions, what are the criteria that lead someone like Mitchell to have that strong, that defiant a love for life and for wanting to live life to the fullest? And the best answer that I can come up with is in the request that Mitchell made to me some months ago in the fall of 2020 when he said, Pastor Ron, and by the way, people don't call me Pastor Ron anymore for 20 years, but whenever I talked to Mitchell, I was Pastor Ron. And he said, Pastor Ron, when it comes time for my memorial service, can you speak about salvation? And on the one hand, that's not a hard request for me to fulfill. And on the other hand, I think to myself, that's not so easy in terms of what was it that Mitchell really wanted his life and any of our memories and reflections of his life to communicate. And so I've spent most of the last 25 years in biblical scholarship, teaching in colleges and universities and giving talks in a variety of places. And I've often taught university students on Jesus' announcement of the kingdom of God, of the good news that God's shalom, God's peace, God's order was breaking into the world, and that people could experience it. Jesus seemed to promise people could experience it in their own lives, in their own lifetime. And what Jesus was offering, in hindsight, was salvation. But I tried to do a little bit of digging for the sake of this conversation and this reflection, because the Hebrew verb yasha, from which we get the notion or the concept of salvation, literally just means to rescue, to heal, or to save. Yasha. That verb, if it sounds at all familiar to you, is the verb that lies behind the noun name, the proper name, Yeshua. That's where we get our English version of that name, Jesus. In other words, the name Jesus simply is the noun that refers to what happens when God saves, heals, restores, rescues people. Jesus was the embodiment of God's salvation. Jesus was and is what it looks like for God to come into the difficulties and the complexities of our life and to do saving, healing, restoring work. And what Jesus, I believe, in his life and his ministry was looking to bring was the full flourishing of all human life. Salvation looks like what life looks like when God's presence transforms all of our lives to be exactly what they were intended to be. I don't know if you've ever gone on a vacation or been in a particular life stage or circumstance where you could just sit down and say, oh man, this is exactly what I imagine a good life to be. Well, salvation is nothing less than experiencing what God intends all of us to experience as we live the life of flourishing. Now, that life will sometimes come with pain, because here's how the prophet Micah, in chapter 6, verse 8 of Micah, talked about the life of salvation. He said the following words. He's told you, O human being, O person, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. That's salvation. If you were to ask me, what does it look like for salvation to come to any person, any community, any province or state, any nation or country or region? What does it look like when Yahweh's salvation comes? It's when people live in a way that does justice, loves mercy, and walks humbly with God. And as I think about Mitchell's life, I think about how important doing things the right way was to Mitchell. When Mitchell saw that something was wrong, when he saw that there was a relationship that was fractured, when he believed that someone he loved was doing things that he was convinced were harming others, Mitchell would say something. Because Mitchell was committed to doing justice. There's not a person who knows Mitchell that wouldn't remember that Mitchell was committed to life being lived in a way that honors God and is committed to the flourishing of those around us. So one way to ask that question about justice is just to say, do the people that our lives touch experience better life, more wholeness, more healing, more shalom because they know us? I don't think there's a person in the room that I'm talking to today. And I'll tell you personally, as just a human being myself, my life is better because I knew Mitchell Burton. And it's because Mitchell was committed to justice. Mitchell was committed to living his life in a way that brought God's salvation, the way Jesus demonstrated it, to people around him. But Mitchell also loved mercy. Mitchell was amazingly resilient and forgiving and compassionate. Mitchell was not interested in people being proven wrong or people being made to squirm because they'd said something wrong or made a bad decision. Mitchell was someone who loved mercy, loved being reconciled. And it's because Mitchell, he admitted it to me many times, that he wrestled with his own demons, with doubt, with anger, with frustration, with asking God, why am I in this situation? And it's because he knew himself so well that he loved mercy enough to extend it to the people around him. And that too is an expression of God's salvation. And finally, the prophet Micah says, walk humbly with God. Don't think too highly of yourself. Don't try to grasp too much out of this life. Just recognize that only life lived in response to God's incredible love is capable of expressing and giving that love to others. And if you live life that way, if you're able to pass on God's incredible love to people around you, you are living a flourishing life. And by that metric, by that criteria, Mitchell Burton lived a Jesus-centered life, a life that was committed to doing justice, a life that was committed to loving and expressing mercy, and a life that was honest and transparent and joyful enough to walk humbly with God and not to think too highly of himself. The reflections that I've shared with you, while they were prompted by Mitchell's question to me, to say something about salvation, I have to just tell you that I know more about salvation today because I knew Mitchell. I could tell you that I've studied it. I could tell you that I've preached it and taught it. But the truth is, I know salvation personally because people like Mitchell loved me and gave me mercy and made my life better because their eyes were on Jesus. And so that's how I want to close. This is emotional for me. I did not want to say goodbye to Mitchell. That was selfish. It is selfish. I want him back. But I'm deeply honored to remember his life with you and to remind you that Mitchell's life tells us that God is a God who loves justice, who expresses mercy, and offers us the invitation to walk humbly in forgiveness and humility, in joy and laughter, when life is good, when life is not so good, when our bodies work like we think they should, when our bodies give us challenges in ways that we would rather they didn't. I just want to finish by saying that Mitchell is on the ultimate road trip for all the road trips he's ever taken. Today, Mitchell is with Jesus, who was the object of Mitchell's love and affection and the desire of his life. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. Sandy, Dennis, Ian, We love you. Kathy, Annalise, Jaden, Adrian, and Avriel all join me in thanking you for the opportunity to share, and we wish you God's best in the future days and weeks. Peace be with you.